doing a thing? Let's do the thing. If you're familiar with my channel and freaking out about the red thumbnail, I'll say it now. I don't think Shadow of the Colossus is a terrible game. For me, the problems just outweigh the enjoyment, but I'll also admit my bias right here to you. Shadow of the Colossus is one of the only games I've played where discussion and universal praise tarnish my enjoyment and opinion of the game. But long before the universal acclaim, my buddy Max and I played through the majority of it in high school on PS2. I think we were enjoying it for the most part, until we got lost at like Colossus number 14 or something. I don't even blame our younger selves for missing it and not finding it, because it was hard as hell for me to find it, and I'm a grown-ass man-child. I even think back then I saw the faults and problems that were present in Shadow of the Colossus. Just like in my eco review, I'm gonna try my best to avoid the use of the word pretentious, because it can be used to hand-wave the issues away, but I do think a lot of Shadow of the Colossus is pretentious. I respect that Shadow of the Colossus is comprised entirely of boss fights. I think that's great. It's no nonsense. No worthless enemy trash to clear, no runarounds for keys or other garbage, and no tedious platforming puzzles getting in the way. Well, maybe there are a bit, but I think more games should do it, honestly. It's one of the reasons I love Monster Hunter so much. It's 90% boss fights. The issue I have is that rarely are the Colossus interesting or fun to fight. The core mechanics of Shadow of the Colossus are riding on your horse, some basic jumping and climbing, and then you have to stab weak points. Every single Colossus falls into the same formula. You have to go find it, for one. Then you have to figure out how to climb it, usually by doing something obvious with the environment and architecture. Then you have to find its weak points and stab them. That makes Shadow of the Colossus feel less like an action-adventure game and more like a cleverly designed puzzle game. Going with that, a lot of the Colossi are what you'd consider gimmicky. There are two that fly, two that swim, a couple that are really big, and they all have their own little nuances. There are rarely ways to defeat Colossi by thinking outside the box. You're pigeonholed into following the scripted sequence of events. It makes fights boring and repetitive, especially on replays or if you accidentally fall off and have to repeat it. Some of them are fun and enjoyable. I enjoyed the fights versus the third Colossus Gaius and the fifth Avion. A lot of them do feel very similar, and even ones that are unique like number 12, Pelagia, don't feel that unique. The common tie to all the Colossus is that they're quite boring, and they're often very long-winded. If you enjoyed a Colossus, you can refight it, but it requires you to go back to their corpse. It's a nice feature, but traversing the world is one of the worst aspects of Shadow of the Colossus. This gets remedied in time attack mode, where you simply pray at the statue in the temple and you're automatically taken to the boss fight. So I distinctly remember reading or watching a developer interview that the developers wanted aggro, your horse, to behave like a real horse, and as such, he will occasionally just flat out ignore commands or take his sweet time in responding. That is horrendous from a gameplay standpoint. It can lead to you missing jumps to Mount Colossi or having to wait for aggro because he ran off even though you've whistled for him a dozen times. It's a design decision that's more pretentious than anything. A cool idea that would have been better left on the cutting room floor. It adds nothing to the game besides making it more tedious and annoying. There are times you should try to be realistic, but when aggro is a fundamental part of fighting about half of the Colossi and the vast majority of your world traversal experience, he should be responsive. I'll talk more about world traversal later because I think it relates more to the length and pacing rather than the gameplay. Shadow of the Colossus is very similar to Eco in that there is a very minimalistic aesthetic present, except for when it's inconvenient. Shadow of the Colossus feels a lot more like a video game than Eco. You have to have a HUD now because of the health bar and grip meter and the equipped weapon, and there would be no reasonable way to convey that information without it, so it hurts that minimalistic feel a little bit. I also think the grip meter is just gaudy and horrible to look at, especially once you get to higher grip levels. I'm gonna show you a screenshot right now of a maxed out or near maxed out grip meter. It's just this horrible Pepto-Bismol pink stain on your screen. I don't see what the problem would have been with just having another bar under the health bar like a ton of other games do. You can convey the same stabbing power with a bar that you can with a circle. Tons of other games have done it. It was just a horrendous design decision. It feels like a mistake. It truly ruins the aesthetic and it just looks horrible. There was also a very prominent soundtrack this time, which again reinforces the game feel along with the HUD changes. You'll be hearing the same tune, Revived Power, in every Colossi encounter, usually when you stab a weak point. For the most part, the music is good, but there are a few key tracks that just get played over and over throughout the fights, even when the Colossus has a unique track. It just feels like a waste. So when you're fighting Colossus, Dorman will also give you advice on how to beat them a lot of the time, in a very similar vein to other helpers in games like Navi from Legend of Zelda. It's completely unprompted and often unnecessary or unwelcome. A lot of the Colossi fights are just really slow to start up. There's usually a period of observation of the Colossus and the environment in the beginning of the fight to try to figure out what you need to do. If you're watching and waiting for the Colossus to do something specific so you can get on it, you'll often have Dorman telling you some really obvious advice. It's such a dramatic change from Eco. Eco told you basically nothing, you just kinda went and did your thing. Yorda would occasionally point to something, but that was basically it. There's such a blatant tonal shift from Eco that it makes me think that Shadow of the Colossus was done by an almost entirely different team, you know, barring the artists. It just didn't need to be in Shadow of the Colossus at all. It comes off as incredibly handholdy, and that's a terrible thing to have. Shadow of the Colossus is largely a puzzle game about figuring out ways to get onto the Colossus to take out the weak points. When you have Dorman giving you hints before you've even gotten a chance to try something on your own, it just kind of ruins the experience. The difficulty kind of feels front and rear loaded again, just like the story. The first 3 or 4 Colossi can be frustrating because your stamina is so low and it's very easy to fall off. All having the low stamina does is make you repeat the mounting process, which is tedious. As you kill the Colossus, you get more stamina and health, which generally makes the game easier and more forgiving to get by. You can also find fruit and whitetail lizards throughout the game that increase your max health and stamina, but I only found a handful, and the gains are so minor versus killing a Colossus that it's almost not worth it to even bother looking for them. I think the Colossus I struggled with most was the 10th one, Dirge. It's essentially a giant sandworm and you need to shoot its eyes to cause it to crash into a pillar or a wall. This part was very frustrating because you have to control aggro, running forward while you have to maintain the camera and aim behind you. It's very easy to get stuck on some debris or columns in the environment, and if Dirge hits you, it does a lot of damage. I died twice to Dirge, but those are my only deaths in Shadow of the Colossus, outside of Malice. Then you have Colossus number 16 Malice, where he has one-hit kill or near one-hit kill lasers on the way to him, and it makes the fight more annoying than anything else. I died a few times to Malice, but once you get on Malice, it's super easy to kill him. Most of the Colossi just aren't very hard. For the most part, they're just very scripted, and that makes them long and drawn out, especially if you aren't quick or you don't get a one-cycle kill. Colossus number 13, Phalanx, definitely falls into that territory. It's not hard at all. It's just a very drawn out fight, especially if you don't get the one cycle kill. I would make a strong argument that the hardest part of Shadow of the Colossus is actually finding the damn things. Shadow of the Colossus is almost identical to Eco, believe it or not. I completed it in 5 hours, 49 minutes, and 31 seconds versus Eco's 5 hours, 21 minutes, and 27 seconds. In terms of pacing, most of my time in Shadow of the Colossus felt like I was just looking for the Colossus. It's an incredibly dull experience. The world is largely devoid of anything interesting. Occasionally there will be some architecture hiding a whitetail lizard or a save point shrine, which I don't really understand why they exist, because you get infinite retries at the Colossus anyways. Shadow of the Colossus' length is grossly bloated out because you spend so much time just running around. It's seriously about 50-50 playtime of running around finding the Colossus and actually fighting them. If there was literally anything to see in the world, I wouldn't mind journeying. If you could see Colossi flying around or running around from a huge distance, that it would at least make the world interesting. If the save shrines had information or backstory, I wouldn't mind it. It's just empty expanses of nothing the whole game. Fights with the Colossi themselves are often just plagued by scripted sequences. Some of the Colossi like number 7 Hydrus and number 13 Phalanx just straight up reset if you take too long. This means you have to wait around and then redo something you've already done to get another attempt at stabbing weak points. It turns the fight into a drawn out slog. Mounting the Colossi the first time is usually enjoyable to figure out, but the second or third time you have to do it, it almost always feels really boring because it's exactly the same as the first time you did it. Bosses like Phalanx are also just really annoying to mount because of the precision jumping and positioning required to get on it, so repeating it is quite frustrating and often takes more attempts than necessary. I mounted Phalanx fine the first time, and when I took too long, I was kicked off of it. It took me another 3 attempts to actually get on it again, and you have to do a lot of really stupid shooting to get on it again, which is horrible. Just horrible. Wander enters the Forbidden Land on his horse aggro carrying a deceased woman. Wanderer speaks with an old god named Dorman and agrees to destroy the Colossi in exchange for bringing the woman back to life. Wanderer kills the Colossi and begins to turn pale and have black marks across his face and arms. After killing 12 of the Colossus, a group of humans are shown and reveal that they are pursuing Wanderer. Dorman encourages Wanderer to finish what he started and to speed up killing the remaining Colossi. While approaching the final Colossus, a stone bridge collapses and aggro throws Wanderer to safety but falls into the river below. Wanderer defeats the final Colossus just as the humans arrive. The leader of the humans reveals that Wanderer is a thief who stole the ancient sword, and is shocked to see that Wanderer is cursed with horns. Dorman takes over Wanderer's body and the humans escape. The leader throws the sword into a pond in the temple that causes Dorman and Wanderer to be sucked in. The woman from the beginning of the game wakes up, Aggro limps towards her, and the two of them find a crying child with horns in the pond. The girl picks up the child and the group wanders to a secret garden above the temple. then the game's over. It's the same shtick as Eco. The story is front and rear loaded with virtually nothing in between. There is the cutscene in the middle with the guys riding the horses, but for the most part, you're very bare bones on direct story until the very end. You're never told Wander's relationship with the girl, or Wander's background, or anything like that, even at the end. There are subtleties though. As you kill Colossi, Wander gets more pale and gets black markings all over his body. These are kind of hard to notice as you're usually looking at Wander's back, but you can make the assertion that it's not all wine and roses in the Sacred Land when all the black shit goes into Wander after killing a Colossus. You can infer that Wander isn't a swordsman because of the way he clumsily swings it, and he is much more prominent with his bow. Obviously his skill is irrelevant with the sword, since he never really uses the sword in any way other than stabbing weak points. Simple stories aren't bad. I don't think Shadow of the Colossus story is terrible either. It's just a little too bare bones. I would have liked some questions answered. You know, who made the Colossi? Is Dorman actually evil? I would have liked to know Wander's backstory a bit, or at the very least his relationship with the girl. We'll just never know because it's easier to leave things like that up in the air. What's really surprising to me is that Dorman actually follows through with his word and revives the girl. I guess it would be too bleak for Team Eco to have something like that since they really want to have happy endings that are rife with ambiguity. I don't need a they lived happily ever after ending, but I would like something, anything past what we got. I guess having Aggro show up at the end isn't really that happy of an ending because leg injuries to horses are basically a death sentence. The part with Aggro showing up at the end just really showcases that Team Eco doesn't want a sad ending. They want everything to be hunky-dory and to be left to be interpreted. Honestly, the ties to Eco are so minor that they may as well not be present. They just threw in a boy with horns at the end and some shadowy figures because it's a prequel that has no real solid ties to the Eco. I suppose you could infer that the events of Shadow of the Colossus has Wander creating the curse that causes the outbreak of horned children in Eco, but at the same time, how exactly? The bridge out of the Sacred Land is destroyed. Do the revived girl and the baby escape somehow? Do they repopulate the Sacred Land and create a new society? It just doesn't really make any sense, and Team Eco clearly have no obligation to explain anything. I enjoyed parts of Shadow of the Colossus. It can be fun to figure out how to mount a Colossus. The problem is that if you fall off, you're just repeating the same steps again, which pushes it to tedium rather than fun. Another issue is that the Colossus have random shakes which completely prevent you from climbing. It turns fights into largely waiting games, which is just really boring. This is mostly a problem against the early Colossus because of the low stamina bar, and the shakes can cause you to run out of stamina and force you to have to mount them again, and it feels entirely based on luck. I will freely admit that you can do some cool tricks to speed up the process. I've seen people do some crazy jumps on Gaius, where they time a jump so its huge arm throws them onto its head or shoulders. Things like that are cool, but require a lot of practice and precise timings. I don't think Shadow of the Colossus is built around that precise control, nor is it worth the time invested to get good at it. I actually really liked the 15th Colossus, Argus. I felt like it was the most interesting to fight because it really felt like you needed to use everything you'd learned throughout the game. You had to be clever with the environment to finally mount it. You needed to use your head a bit to find that last glyph hidden on his hand. That was the only one that I felt was genuinely enjoyable, or took more than a second to figure out. And by that time the game is mostly over. Most of the other Colossi are incredibly one note in what you need to do, and it's usually really obvious to figure them out. The world is just too damn big, and I don't think that the size would even be a problem if the game was restructured. The linear nature of fighting the Colossus means they simply don't appear until you get to them in their predetermined position out of 16. If you were told by Dorman to explore the Sacred Land and take out the Colossus, that would have been enough, but instead your hand is held and you're told which one, where it is, and how to take it out. I think if every Colossus was available from the get-go, it would be way more interesting and engaging. You would feel like you were actually hunting them down and, you know, having a real adventure. There's honestly no reason why this couldn't have been the case, and I think that might have been the intention from the beginning. I think the reason they didn't do it is largely because of the stamina and health restrictions early on, which honestly could have been solved with some simple scaling math where the remaining Colossi get stronger as the others are killed, or just even restructuring the stamina system itself. Navigating the huge world also requires the sword's light triangulation mechanic. It's accurate in that it draws a straight line from you to the Colossus, but for a lot of the Colossi, it's just unhelpful and often a downright detriment to telling you the correct way to go. Very frequently, you need to blatantly ignore the sword and take a wild guess at the correct route. This also makes finding them significantly longer than it needed to be, since you can go down wrong paths that lead to dead ends, forcing you to backtrack. I think you needed ways to actually fight the Colossi instead of just scripted sequences of mounting them and stabbing the weak points. It would be nice if you could do other things. You use a handful of environmental hazards, but it could have been expanded upon. More Colossi needed to have more mounting options. It'd be cool if you could climb walls or sneak around to get on top of them, and you really just don't have options like that for most of the Colossi. It'd be nice to get more tools to fight them as you go on as well. You will get additional equipment, but only in the hard and time attack modes, which makes playing your first time through seem way less interesting than it could have been. It just sucks that every single Colossus is fought exactly the same way every time. If even there was 2 options to get on top of the Colossi for every single one, it would be a lot better of an experience and more interesting. Shadow of the Colossus has concepts that I think a lot more games need. The idea of a game consisting only of a boss rush? Fantastic. I'm all about that. But for every great idea or mechanic, there's just 2 more that fail. I want to like it, but a large part of my distaste for it is just because it's so boring. Colossi are all the same to fight, scripted sequences with a gimmick. The world is a chore to traverse. The sword light mechanic is worthless besides giving you a very general idea of where to go. The worst part is it's just pretentious in its presentation. It's begging to be minimal like Eco, but misses the part with a horrendous HUD and just worse design decisions across the board. In terms of the value of the HD collection, you can calmly find it for 10 to 20 bucks or less, and it's about 12 hours of gameplay, give or take, just beating Eco and Shadow of the Colossus. It's cheap enough that I'd say it's worth it based strictly on dollar an hour value. In my Eco review, I suggest that you play it to form your own opinion of it, and I think Shadow of the Colossus is in the same boat. It's often touted as the paragon of the video games are art argument. I just don't agree. An ambiguous story, boring world traversal, boring one-note boss fights, and pretentious presentation does not equate to art.